It's a little weird. I don't have anything to hide behind. Also, it's kind of weird to have a choir. But I'm not alone. So we started a few weeks ago with a series of messages that we're calling soul music. We've had a couple of interruptions going along the way with this, but we will be continuing this for the next couple of weeks. But soul music, we're concentrating in the Psalms because that's what the Psalms, where they came from the soul, and the purpose that they were sung and written was to be encouragement, be a reminder. And therefore, they are also for us. Today, we're going to be looking at Psalms 3, which is really a pretty unique psalm. It's the first time that the word psalm is used. The Hebrew word there for psalm is mizmor. And it's basically a term and speaks of a poem that is to be sung to musical accompaniment. This is probably the first song that David wrote. Therefore, we're calling it a song for today. Because the psalm speaks to each one of us in our lives as we live it day in and day out. The background for this psalm is really bad news. We've all experienced maybe a day, maybe a week, even maybe a longer period of time where bad news is good news because it just seems like the news keeps getting worse and worse and worse. I read a story about a doctor who called his patient and he said, "John, I've got some bad news and I've got some worse news for you." And John replied back and said, "Well, what's the bad news?" And the doctor told him that you only have 24 hours to live. And John responded back, "Well, that's pretty bad news. What's the worst news?" And the doctor said, "Well, I tried to call you yesterday." That's worse news for sure. For David, here with the Psalms, the background for Psalms 3, David is experiencing one of those dark days. His son Absalom has rebelled against him. He has basically taken the kingdom from David and is now pursuing David, trying to kill him. David's kingdom that he had is now just crumbling all around him. David has gone from being a king to being a criminal on the run. So he's not sitting in a very good place. This is the setting behind this psalm that God gave to David. Now, this psalm can be easily split into 3 parts, which is good because they say messages are supposed to be 3 parts. So it fits real easy. And as you will notice as we go through Psalms, that it is marked with the word Selah 3 times. Now, this word Selah means to pause, to stop and think about what you just heard. To pause. Stop and think about what you just heard. To be still. It's kind of a spiritual speed bump that get you to slow down, to listen to what God is saying to you. Now remember, as we have talked about with Psalms, they are songs that are written for and sung by God's people, of which we are a part of. So then, if you are having troubles, problems, under stress, you are having maybe relational difficulties, you are having physical, mental, or emotional issues, or maybe you're just unjustly being criticized, then this song, Psalms 3, is a song for you today. What God basically does for David is he gives him bad news, then he gives him good news, and then he gives him best news in this Psalms 3. So first of all, the bad news. You have foes who will be against you. That's bad news. If you are a follower of Jesus, if you've determined that God is going to take first place in your life, then the world is a battleground for you. War has been declared and you are called so-called public enemy number one. There will be foes. Looking at verse 1 of Psalms 3. O Lord, how many are my foes? Some versions use the word adversaries there. Many are rising against me. Can you just kind of picture David's mental state here at this place? A Christian doesn't have to go looking for trouble. If you are a child of God, trouble will be looking for you. That is bad news, isn't it? Kind of depressing. Psalms 119, we read that many are my persecutors, my adversaries. Psalms 34, many are the afflictions of the righteous. Every morning that we get up, we have at least 3 enemies that are just waiting for us to walk through the door. I have an enemy around me, enemy within me, an enemy beneath me. What the Bible calls these is the world, the flesh, and the devil. The world is my external foe, the flesh is my internal foe, and the devil is my spiritual foe. All 3 of these enemies are at work 24/7 to try to distract us. We talked about Wednesday night some, to distract us from God and to try to cause us to lose our witness, lose our testimony, maybe even lose our character. Now, this bad news shouldn't take us by surprise. Jesus even told us in John 3:19, this is the judgment. The light has come into the world, and the people loved the darkness rather than the light. Why? Because their works were evil. We are light living in darkness, and darkness hates light. Therefore, we have foes. We have those that are going to be against us, those that are going to try to douse our light. Listen here to continuing with Psalms 3, to what David's enemies, his foes, are saying about him. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Selah. Here they're laughing at David's faith. They're even mocking God. This word salvation, some translations use the word deliverance there. But it's a word that actually means victory, like we had talked about earlier. So what actually these people are saying is, David, we thought you used to sing, how great is your God. Where is your great God now? You are not living a very victorious life. It's sad to say the world says this about many of us Christians today. I mean, let's be honest. Most of the world doesn't take the church seriously. And because of that, the world doesn't take God seriously. And maybe the reason this happens, sad to say, is that the world sees a church that doesn't take God seriously. I read a devotion a few weeks ago. It was one of those devotions that has the thought of the day that's connected at the end of it. And I thought it was pretty fitting as I read that devotion, this thought for this message. The world cannot see our God, but they can see our faith. And they will measure the size of our God by the size of our faith. The world cannot see our God, but they can see our faith. And they will measure the size of our God by the size of our faith. They are watching. They are paying attention. What we need to do, both in the way we live our day-to-day lives and how we worship, is to show the world how great our faith is and that we serve a great God. 1 Samuel 2 says, there is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. We need to remember this truth. Even though there are foes against us, as Samuel says, our God is great. Which leads us then to step 2. You have a Father that is always with you. David had made the same fatal error that many of us make. When we're in the middle of trials, troubles, difficulties, we tend to focus on our foes and our fears. And that makes our life then full of doubt, discouragement, depression, defeat. One of the purposes, and actually we could say even the benefits of trials and troubles, is to turn our focus to God. Whenever problems and troubles come into our lives, we tend to focus on every little flaw about ourselves and beat ourselves up, when we ought to be using them to make us lift our heads and look to God. David, at the end of the verse 2, has this word, Selah. Remember what we call that? That's a spiritual speed bump. Slow down, stop, pause, think about what you just heard. And he is, oh Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying, my soul, there is no salvation for him in God. Selah. Think about that. Pause on that. And David does. And all of a sudden he comes to verse 3. But you, O Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, the lifter of my head. Excuse me. I cried aloud to the Lord, and he answered me from his holy hill. Selah, pause. Think about that. You see the word about me? It literally means to around, to surround me. That means in front and back, to either side, all around me. When David took a break from all of his worries, all of his problems, when he, Selah, hit that spiritual speed bump, he was reminded that God is a shield around him. Psalm 34, we read, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. Just think about that. Take a Selah moment. Think about it. The Lord encamps around those that fear him. He's not just right beside you. He's in front of you, preparing the way. He's behind you, guarding all of those things from the past. He's keeping you on the straight path, from going to the right or to the left, going his direction. If you are facing problems, difficulties, maybe mountains you don't know if that you can climb or not, that's just a time to Selah. Stop. Be still. Remember, God is right here with you. Remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Thrown into the fiery furnace. And as those from outside looked in there, what did they see? They saw a fourth member in there. And he looked like the Son of God. They were not alone. As we look at the disciples in the boat, in the storm in the middle of the sea, afraid of being sunk, Jesus comes to them walking on the water. In the storm, he was still with them. Another time out in the water, he was in the boat with them, in their trouble, in their tribulation part. As Paul is sitting in the prison in Rome waiting to be executed, God is still there with him. David says here that God is my glory, the lifter of my head. Whenever we're discouraged, feeling defeated or depressed, what do we tend to do? We tend to walk around kind of like Charlie Brown or Eeyore. Oh, woe's me. We hang our heads. We look depressed. In verse 1 and 2, troubles were weighing David down. His shoulders were drooping. His spirit was sagging. His head was hanging. Selah. He paused, thought about it a little bit, and was reminded, you can never focus on God by looking down. That is why our outlook is determined by our uplook. In Luke 21, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and then he's describing the latter days when God's wrath is going to be poured out. And he says in Luke 21 that when those things begin to take place, straighten up and lift up your heads. Why? Because your redemption is drawing near. When you're hanging your head looking down or focusing on one of those enemies that we talked about earlier that you face every day in this world, when you're looking at them, looking down, you are defeated. You cannot thrive. You cannot flourish like we've been trying to talk about this year. And definitely you are not going to be living life to the full that Jesus said that he came to give us. Just look again at verse 1 and 2. Where is his focus? The only time that God is mentioned here is by his enemies. And it's in a mocking way. But then beginning at verse 3 and for the rest of the chapter, David mentions God, the Lord, 5 times. God was there to meet David's needs all the time. But before David could have God's assistance, God demanded David's attention. That happened when David Sela'd, I don't know if that's a real word or not, but when he paused, when he stayed still, slowed down, and let God lift his head to gaze into God's goodness, to be reminded of God's love for him. That Selah made God or David pay attention to God's presence. When David was reminded of this, then we came to verse 5. I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. David was no longer surrounded by his luxuries in a palace. He was no longer loved by his people. He was no longer commander of his vast army. And yet he said, basically, I had the best night of sleep I've had for years. Finally, he had discovered that true security and true peacefulness is found in God and in God alone. And because of that, you have a future that should encourage you. I don't know what kind of problems you face, what kind of difficulties that you might be swimming against right now, how high the mountains are that you're trying to climb. But I can tell you, if you know God, your future is bright. How can I say that? Because God has promised that. And if you will just Selah for a moment, you will remember that. When David finally realized that, with God, there was really no way to lose. He went back to being the man that God created him to be, the person God called him to be. His courage came back. Look at verse 6. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around. It's actually kind of weird there, isn't it? You would think anyone with common sense would be afraid of many thousands of people surrounding you, wanting your scalp. But David here is basically saying, bring them on. I'm not afraid of anyone, no matter how big he is or how numerous they are. How could David say that? Because when David Sela'd, he understood that God plus one is a majority in any situation. And he continues, arise then, O Lord, save me. Oh my God. For you strike out my enemies on the cheek. You break their teeth of the wicked. Maybe you've heard the saying, if God is on your side, it doesn't matter who's not. But if God is not on your side, it doesn't matter who is. If God is on your side, it doesn't matter who is not. But if God is not on your side, it doesn't matter who is. We don't need to get on the biggest side. We need to get on God's side. Because on God's side, which is the best side, does not necessarily mean that it is the biggest. Not only did David's courage come back, but David's confidence came back. It says here in verse 8, salvation belongs to the Lord. Here again, this word salvation in verse 8 is the same word that is used for deliverance back in verse 2, salvation, and it means victory. Be easily translated as victory. Victory belongs to the Lord, he says here. Now, if victory belongs to the Lord, and if you are a child of God, and you belong to the Lord, what does that mean? Victory belongs to you. Victory belongs to us. Any child of God who is living in the Word of God, walking in the will of God, filled with the Spirit of God and committed to the work of God, can never, ever lose. That is why our confidence should be totally unshaken. Looking at a couple of the verses that we looked at earlier, which I only used a part of, I want you to see how the rest of them went. Many are my persecutors and my adversaries, but I do not swerve from your testimony. Psalm 34, many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers them out of them all. Going to Psalm 16, I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I shall not be shaken. Psalm 62, verses 1 and 2. For God alone my soul waits in silence. That's Selah. From him comes my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. Here again, substitute victory. For God alone my soul waits in silence. For him comes my victory. He is my rock. He is my victory. He is my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. David's courage, confidence, and his contentment had returned to him. And he completes this psalm with, your blessing be upon your people. And then finishes it with, Selah. We too, as David finally understood, need to understand that even in the middle of our deepest, darkest trials, God's blessing always is upon us. Doesn't matter how dark or how thick looking the thunderclouds might be that are hanging over you, they contain showers of blessing. As a child of God, you never are out from under his blessings. So the next time that one of those difficult, stressful, face to the grounds moments face you, Selah. And remember, you have a song for today. This very day. This very moment. And that psalm is, yes, you will have foes that will be against you. But you have a heavenly Father that is always for you. And your future is bright because he has promised his presence and his brightness to you. Father, thank you for this reminder once again. That you are with us, no matter what we are going through. Forgive us for the times when we forget that. And we lose our courage. We lose our confidence. And we lose our contentment as David at the beginning of this psalm. But Father, I pray that you would help us to pay attention to your Spirit and just listen to your voice and hear you say, Selah. Pause. Be still. Take a moment and think of me. Help us, Father, to do that. And be the lifter of our heads. Let us feel your hand under our chin and raising it up to look at you and your amazing love for each one of us. I pray that for each one here, Father, and each one that is listening and watching online, Father, that they would be still and let you be their God. Let you be their Father, their good, good Father that you want them to be. That you want to be to them. Remind us of this every day. In Jesus' name.